This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. If a sheep had got in here unnoticed, what else had? For a second she thought her friends were dead, but a loud snore from Bryn reassured her. A quick glance outside showed no soldiers or farmers nearby. Just that stupid sheep. She sighed in relief. They had been incredibly lucky. With the toe of her boot, she nudged the others awake. Marcus woke instantly, knife in hand. Bryn muttered and batted at her foot before rolling over. She pushed him harder until the boy finally sat up and rubbed his eyes, yawning. Phoenix heaved himself up, groaning. Man, what time is it? I feel like a truck hit me. What's a truck? Bryn asked sleepily. It's almost dusk, Jade said, ignoring the question. She frowned at the others. We've all been asleep for several hours. Phoenix yawned and shrugged. Marcus pursed his lips. Jade wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Luckily, no one found us except a sheep. But we can't let it happen again. Bryn smothered a giggle and said something she couldn't quite hear about being savaged by fierce sheep. Jade chose to ignore the wisecrack. What do we do? It's almost too dark to go on. Do we stay here? There's more food in the bag if you're hungry. But we've only got about an hour more to walk, Bryn urged. And I'm still stuffed. He rubbed his belly and belched. We can't go anywhere in the dark, Phoenix sided with Jade. Torches are too risky, and Jade shouldn't be expected to lead us half-blind idiots around all night. Besides, he added with a glance at Jade's face, I think we could use some more rest before we attempt to steal the jewel. But if we go now, we can meet the druids tonight and have the jewel before tomorrow night, Bryn insisted. Why is tonight so important? Jade frowned at the boy. Because tomorrow night will be the night before spring equinox. The boy seemed surprised that they had no idea what he was talking about. Spring equinox is one of the big occasions for the druids, one of the few times each year when you're absolutely certain to find them at Carrega Amgarn. At other times, they're really hard to find. The boy shook his head sadly and cast a half-annoyed, half-apologetic look at Marcus. The Romans have been trying to wipe out the druids all over Britain. 2 years ago they destroyed the druid temple at Mona. Most of the time they're in hiding, like the fairy. The others digested this information in silence for a few moments. So why don't we just go tomorrow night to speak to Druid? Jade asked the question they were all thinking. Bryn stared at them in astonishment, clearly unable to fathom their stupidity. Because that will be too late. At dawn the next day, they hold the spring equinox ceremony. You know, when the druids give sacrifices and gifts to the earth goddess who makes all the plants grow and the animals thrive. He waved his skinny arms around to indicate the natural world. They choose the gifts tonight. And let me guess, Jade drew the obvious conclusion. The Jewel of Asgard is destined to be one of those sacrificial gifts to the earth goddess. Bryn blinked at her and nodded. Of course. That's how I knew he had it. Druid told me he had charge of it when he visited us, just a few weeks before my parents, His animated little face fell and Marcus laid a hand on his shoulder. He shrugged it off. I just didn't know which stone circle he'd be at until I met you two. They do the ceremony at a different circle each year. You could have told us earlier, dude. We didn't know he had it. Phoenix closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose between 2 fingers. So tell me again how Druid is just going to give the jewel to us. Oh well, Bryn said sheepishly. I kind expected that we could trade something equally valuable. Maybe the Hylian Bagya, or all the stuff in it. Marcus, Phoenix, and Jade all gazed at Bryn in wonder. You'd be prepared to give away all that Roman money and the bag to help us complete our quest? Jade voiced their amazement. Bryn's mouth firmed. If it got us closer to killing Feng Zhudai, I'd do just about anything. The three older companions exchanged looks and nodded in silent agreement. Bryn's determination was infectious. Sleep suddenly didn't seem quite as urgent as the need to keep moving. Without further discussion, they gathered their gear, and with a quick glance around, stole from the hut and headed southwest across the fields. The sun set in spectacular fashion behind distant hills. For a while they moved more slowly through the gathering dusk, picking their way carefully over furrowed ground. The moon had not yet risen. Before long it was too dark for the humans to see. Jade took over, leading them through the gathering gloom until they stubbed their toes once too often, and she was forced to call a halt. "Hang on." She rummaged in her herb bag. "I think I've worked out a spell for this. Everyone hold out a hand." They did as instructed, and she placed a small, soft object in each outstretched hand. "Feels like moss," Bryn said, surprised. "It is. Just a moment." Jade muttered a few elven words, and the little bundles of moss began to glow with a soft, greenish light. "If you shield them with your other hand," she instructed, "you should be able to see the ground in front of your feet, at least." "Won't the lights be seen by Romans or farmers?" Marcus queried. "We don't have much choice. Hopefully they'll just think they're will-o'-the-wisps or something and leave us alone." Jade shrugged, glancing into the darkness. She asked them to pocket the moss. Then they spent a few minutes consulting the heavens, reading the star constellations overhead to determine their direction. It was tricky, as the sky was again partially overcast. "Okay," she finally said on a sigh. "If we're right, we should go this way." She pointed into the darkness. "What do you think, Bryn?" The boy cocked his head, stared at the sky again for a moment, then nodded in sharp agreement. "Seems about right to me. We should be into that forest we saw from the fields any time now. We'll have to be careful we don't get lost. The druids should be somewhere nearby. This is very close to where they met us when we brought Duid." In strained silence, the four travelers trudged their way across the uneven fields, heading south and west through the cool night. It was hard to tell how long they had been walking when they first heard the noises. One by one, they all became aware of the sound of stealthy movement off to one side. Jade caught Phoenix's wary glance around, and knew he'd heard it too. A change in Marcus's breathing and the slight scrape of metal told her the Roman had tensed and half-drawn his sword. With a gesture, she beckoned them to gather close. "I don't think it's Romans," she whispered as they huddled around. "I'm not even sure it's human." "Agreed," Marcus nodded. Bryn looked up at him with huge dark eyes. Phoenix grimaced and drew his weapon. "If it's not human, I'm not sure I want to know what it is." "I'll find out." Jade jerked upright and flung back the hood of her cloak with a sudden defiant movement. She flipped her long hair back to reveal her ears and held up her moss light close to them. In a carrying voice, she announced to the darkness, "We are friends. Come to visit the druid brother of one of our companions." There was silence. She nodded at Bryn, who swallowed hard and held up his own moss light. "Duid?" His voice quavered. "It's me, Bryn. If you're there, it's okay. They're friends." An animal made a sort of whining, barking noise close by, followed by the sound of 4 feet padding. It stopped, and without warning, a tall, dark-clad man stepped within the circle of faint light. His face lay in the shadow of a deep-cowled hood. Broad hands were clasped across his stomach. Jade regarded him apprehensively, backing away as he approached. The man reached up and pushed back his hood to reveal a wide, joyously grinning face that bore a striking resemblance to Bryn's. Bryn squeaked with delight and flung himself into his brother's arms. Druid picked up his sibling in a huge bear hug and laughed. Finally, he set the boy down and laid a hand on his head. "You've grown, lad," he said with a fond smile. "Aye." Bryn was obviously too glad for his usual banter. "You're well." Druid looked at the boy's thin face. "Who has had the care of you since our parents died?" He frowned at Jade and the others. "These." "Nay," Bryn replied in outraged tones. "I'm big enough to look after myself, brother." He laid a hand on Jade's arm and spoke with pride. "These are my quest companions and brothers in arms. We seek to—" Jade put a hand on over his. He stopped and looked up at her in surprise. "Careful, Bryn. You may put your brother in danger with too much knowledge." Bryn glanced at his brother, then nodded. "Just be assured," Phoenix added, "that we are enemies of Rome, and yet you walk with your enemy." The druid sent a meaningful look at Marcus. The Roman drew himself up tall, laying a hand on his sword and looking down at the brown-robed druid with cool hauteur. Tension pulled the air between them. Jade stepped forward, laying a calming hand on Marcus's arm. "He is bound to us and no threat to you, either. We trust him." Druid raised his brows. "I hope your trust is not misplaced." Turning his back on the Roman, the tall druid gave Phoenix a faint smile. "You are wise not to entrust others with your plans." He held out a hand and clasped forearms with Phoenix in friendship. "Your little band is welcome with us for the night. Come." He looped an arm around Bryn's shoulders and turned away. Jade followed, eyeing Marcus's black scowl worriedly. Druid led them into a grove of trees not far away. As they crossed beneath the boughs, the darkness thickened. Jade frowned and shook her head. She rubbed her eyes and blinked several times. "What is it?" "Romans. Druids," Phoenix whispered, fingers curling again around the hilt of his sword. "No, it's magic of some sort," she murmured back. "This grove is protected somehow. Look." At her startled gasp, Phoenix glanced up and he too gasped in surprise. What they had taken for a small stand of trees now seemed to be an enormous expanse of forest. Blinding darkness had been replaced with a gentle luminescence, similar to the moss light Jade had created. Endless ancient trunks of trees marched into the distance. Each one glowed with faint green light, giving the entire forest the appearance of being underwater. "It's beautiful." Jade gazed about, awed. "Aye," nodded Druid. "And it's our sanctuary in these troubled times." He pursed his lips and gave a strange, warbling whistle. "My brother druids will be coming to greet you. Then you will go before the elders." "The elders?" Jade was uneasy. Something suddenly felt wrong. Finding Druid had been too simple. Druid nodded. "You'll need to speak to the elders before I can grant your request, of course." Phoenix spoke for them all. "Our request?" Druid bowed, looking amused. "I cannot give you the Jewel of Asgard without the elders' permission." Jade gasped. Marcus took a wary step backward and Phoenix half drew his sword. Even Bryn inched away from his brother, his eyes wide with awe. Chapter 16. Why do you desire the Jewel of Asgard, warrior? Phoenix and the others knelt inside a small circle of glossy black stones, deep in the forest. True to his word, Druid led them through the eerily lit trees and brought them before the council of druid elders. Bryn's brother shepherded them inside the stone circle and pushed them gently to their knees before bowing and retreating outside the stones. Now, Phoenix and his companions must justify themselves and somehow convince the druids to give up the jewel. If that didn't work, they would have to steal it, and Phoenix didn't like their chances of that. There was powerful magic at work in this ancient forest. Even he could sense it. By the way Jade kept blinking and squinting, every stone and trunk of the place must be oozing power. He gathered his thoughts and replied to the question. He couldn't see the speaker, but suspected the elders were lurking in the shadows of the 12 tall standing stones that encircled them. "We have been placed under a guess, good sirs," he began, trying to find the right words to impress these men of ancient power. "We must complete 5 quests. The first of these is to obtain the Jewel of Asgard." "And what will you do with the jewel if you get it?" a second, disembodied voice asked. "Our second quest requires that we take the jewel and return it to its owner in the land of the Norse people, across the sea." Phoenix was surprised to find that piece of information in his head just when he needed it. Previously, he hadn't been able to remember any details for level 2 or 3. He caught Jade's astonished look and shrugged. Bryn's jaw dropped, and Marcus frowned darkly. This was the first time their 2 companions had heard where they were going next, if they managed to complete this level. There was a long silence. Phoenix wondered if he'd said something wrong. A third voice chimed in from behind him. "So you do not wish to use the jewel for the power it holds?" Phoenix glanced at Jade for help. She pulled a face and shook her head. Marcus and Bryn both returned his stare blankly. "I'm sorry." He felt like an idiot for saying it. "But we didn't actually know the jewel had a power. We just want to keep it out of the Romans' hands and return it to its owner, so we can get on with the third quest." This time the silence had a quality of surprise to it. He hoped that was good. "What is the nature of your 5th and final quest, warrior?" Yet another voice asked. "We must master the U-Dragon and defeat the warlock Feng Judai," Phoenix announced boldly. He tried to continue, to explain that Judai was now helping the Romans, but he was drowned out by a babble of voices from the shadows. As much as he strained to hear, the words were meaningless to him. He glanced at the others, but they obviously couldn't understand the language either. Frustrated, Phoenix grimaced and stretched his back. His knees hurt from all this kneeling. "Enough!" The disembodied voice cut across the blether, silencing the others. "We have long known the jewel must be returned. That is not what we must debate here. Its power is too great. We have used it for our own ends and have helped our people as much as we can against the Romans. We cannot keep it any longer, lest we become exactly the sort of tyrants we fight against. Our destiny is fixed, and nothing must prevent it, or the balance will be disturbed. The jewel must be sent back before it falls into Roman hands. The question we must answer is how. Duid, take them away. Come." Duid appeared out of nowhere beside them. He looked troubled as he helped Jade and Bryn to their feet and led the way out of the stone circle. Around them, the voices continued what sounded like a heated argument. "What's going on?" Phoenix asked urgently. "Where are you taking us? Can we have the jewel or not? The elders have heard your request and are considering it." The druid ignored Phoenix's other questions. "I will take you to where you may await the outcome of their decision." "And what if they decide not to give it to us?" Jade demanded. "Then your quest will have failed." Duid's reply was flat and hard as stone. "Come." He continued through the dimly lit forest, ignoring even his young brother's questions and pleas for help. Jade, Phoenix, and Marcus dropped behind slightly. "I don't like this at all," Jade whispered. "I have a bad feeling and a whole lot of questions." "Me neither, and me too," Phoenix agreed. "Like, how did Duid know we wanted the jewel, but not why we wanted it?" "Yes," she added. And why did our reasons cause such an uproar in the Elder Council? She glanced up at Duid's broad back. I can sense there is something really bothering him, but I can't tell what it is. The power here is different from elven magic. It's blocking me. With a grunt of frustration, she waved her hand in an odd little movement. I can't even perform the simplest spell here. There was an edge of panic to her voice. Don't freak, Jade. I'm sure the druids don't mean us any harm. Phoenix tried to reassure her. I agree that it's all a bit weird, but what can we do? We wait, Marcus said imperturbably. Phoenix winced. You keep saying that and I really hate it. Marcus smiled. I know, but can you think of another idea? When Phoenix shook his head, he added, if we can get a look at what the jewel is and where it is kept, we might be able to come up with another plan. He clapped a hand on Phoenix's shoulder. I don't trust these druids, but we are in their hands. We must wait. I still hate it, Phoenix muttered. Here. Duid had halted at the base of two slender beech trees. He swung an arm at the gap between the trunks. Step through here. There are people waiting on the other side to look after you until a decision has been reached. Phoenix felt Jade stiffen next to him. She looked with suspicion at the druid and the trees. There was a faint magical shimmer between the trunks. Are we prisoners? She asked sharply. Phoenix glanced at her in surprise, then peered at the trees and back at Duid, trying to divine what had set her off. She and Marcus both seemed to distrust Bryn's brother. He wondered why. Duid shook his head. You are not our prisoners. He returned her piercing stare steadily for a few moments, then looked down at his young brother. I would like to spend some time with Bryn. He nodded at the trees. Please step through. He will be safe with me. I'd rather we all stayed together. Phoenix tried to sound reasonable. Jade's unease was catching. He didn't want the party to be separated now, even by family. Duid's fingers gripped Bryn's shoulders till the tips whitened. Bryn flinched and sent a puzzled look up at his brother. You must go. Bryn will remain. The druid was implacable. From nowhere, two more druids appeared, big and armed with staves. They stepped forward, crowding the three backward toward the beech trees. Bryn. Jade sent the boy a quick, questioning look. The boy glanced uncertainly between his friends and his brother. I'll be okay. You go in and I'll see you when you get back for the elder's decision. He bit his lip, obviously still unsure, not wanting to abandon either friends or family. Jade nodded and sent one last fierce glare at Duid. She turned and squared her slim shoulders before stepping through the shimmering gateway. Marcus followed. Phoenix hesitated, sent Bryn a quick salute, then stepped through as well. He really didn't want to, but there didn't seem to be many other options. Drop your weapons! With 3 iron spear tips burning the skin of her throat, Jade had no option. She dropped her staff and held her hands up at shoulder height, palms outward. Her brain seethed with panic and anger. They had been tricked. Behind her, she heard Marcus gasp and Phoenix swear in shock as they stepped through the portal from the druid realm into a trap. The druids had betrayed them. 6 Roman soldiers placed their weapons at the boys' throats and demanded surrender. Marcus and Phoenix unslung their weapons and dropped them slowly to the ground. It wasn't like they had a choice. She fumed. At least 100 Roman soldiers had obviously been awaiting their arrival at this point. Rank upon rank stood motionless, swords drawn, arrows nocked, javelins at the ready. Many held burning torches aloft. In the flickering darkness, their hard, angular faces were terrifying. Bryn. Jade felt a small spark of hope leap as she remembered the boy was still with his brother. Duid had chosen to protect his young brother. Perhaps, if they were very lucky, Bryn could find a way to help them. Her heart plummeted again. Bryn was just a kid. He had no powers and no great warrior skills. Even if he could get into the Roman camp, there was no way he could defeat a bunch of trained Roman centurions. He was better off alive and safe with Doid. Move. She was shaken out of her thoughts by the prod of a spear to her ribs. The iron tip burned her skin like fire. She gasped in pain and stumbled ahead. The body of soldiers before them parted, and the three companions were guided roughly into the middle of the force. Ranks closed around them, and they were surrounded on all sides by a wall of points and armor. There was no possibility of escape, unless they could fly. Jade thought briefly of the magic horn given her by Orphanon. This would definitely qualify as dire peril. Unfortunately, all their backpacks were now in the hands of two Roman soldiers. Oh, her heart sank further. That included the Hylian Bagia and all it contained: the horn, money, javelins, food, and half of their travel gear. She turned her head and opened her mouth to speak to Phoenix, but a javelin tip dug uncomfortably into the base of her throat. Hot ice on her skin. No talking. A soldier growled. My orders are to bring you in alive, but just how much alive wasn't specified. Jade swallowed and nodded. The tip withdrew and he motioned for her to keep walking. She did, but the ground blurred as tears of despair and fear filled her eyes. How could they have come so far and failed now? It just wasn't fair. The end of level 1 was almost in sight. She was so close to home, she could almost hear her father's voice. What would happen now? Would she be tortured or killed in this realm? If she were, what would happen back in the real world? Would it be destroyed as the old woman predicted? Right now, she would gladly swap her looks and magic for her sister's teasing and her mother's impatience, and a hug from her father. Oh, how she missed him. More tears gathered. She clenched her teeth, trying to stay calm. Her heart thudded uncomfortably. 2 salty drops spilled down her cheeks. She hung her head to hide them. It would only make things worse if the soldiers saw her as weak. She had to think. If only she were better at these things. There must be a way out of this. No matter how real the old woman said it was, this was still just a computer game. There were always ways to get out, weren't there? Jade almost laughed at the idea. What she needed was a keyboard, a mouse, and a power button. The escape key would be helpful, she thought whimsically. Or how about Control-Alt-Delete to just quit out of the stupid thing altogether? Yeah. She briefly derived satisfaction from the idea of all of these big, stupid Roman bullies being obliterated and deleted and completely. The moment of black humor was fleeting, as fear came surging back. No, this was too real to be deleted that easily. She had to deal with this world as it was. A short while later, they were marched into a large Roman encampment. Rows upon rows of tents were neatly pitched around 2 huge central pavilions, in the middle of a vast, rolling plain of grassland. Beads of dew from the grass had long since soaked their feet. Jaded shivered with the chill. Flowering pink-gray light in the east told her dawn couldn't be far away. It hadn't felt like a whole night had passed, but perhaps time moved differently in the Druid realm, as it had in the fairy one. Jade wondered how the Romans had got ahead of them so fast. How had they known the players were going to see the Druids? Did they know the Druids had the Jewel of Asgard? Even worse, did they already have it? Was the quest over already? Surely not. The Druids had said they couldn't let it fall into Roman hands. Not that they could be trusted, really. If the Romans had the jewel, why would they still be here? They'd be out conquering the whole country, not wasting their time capturing a few fugitives. Would they? There was no way of knowing yet, so she tried to concentrate on her surroundings. Fatigue made it difficult to think. She made an effort to examine the Roman camp, looking for an opportunity to escape either now or later. The camp was stirring as they entered. Guards challenged them at the perimeter. Cooks bustled around numerous campfires, getting breakfast ready for hundreds of troops. Jade estimated there were at least 100 tents or more in the area. That had to mean at least 2 full cohorts of soldiers, plus all the support staff that went with them. They can't have been in the area too long, he decided shrewdly. The grass around the tents was not worn away, and the smell from distant latrine areas wasn't overpowering yet. Maybe only a day or so, at a guess. With that in mind, she had a rough idea of who they might meet when they made it to the ornate pavilions that dominated the central camp. There was only one person in this game who would go to this much trouble to catch them. Only one person who had a vested reason for moving 2 cohorts of soldiers across 100 leagues on a forced march, just to capture 4 people. One person who stood to lose most if they succeeded in level 1 Feng Zhu Dai. Contrary to her expectations, however, they weren't immediately led before the great wizard. Instead, they were pushed into the largest pavilion. It was furnished, but unpeopled. At least 20 guards took up posts all around the tent and 2 inside, so escape was impossible. Trapped, the 3 companions stood and stared at each other. Phoenix inspected the luxurious furnishings and decorations surrounding them. This isn't exactly the prison I was expecting. Whose tent is this, do you think? The canvas walls were hidden by drapes of exotic-looking fabric. Persian rugs littered the floor. Richly embroidered cushions were scattered across every seat and couch. 4 main posts holding up the roof were carved with a riot of fruit and animal shapes. On a nearby, ornate wooden table, a large gold-inlaid jug held some sort of red liquid. 4 wine glasses stood empty next to it. A massive ceramic bowl held figs, oranges, apples, pomegranates, and dates. The bowl was decorated with black and gold images of Roman gods and goddesses. Right in the center of the back wall was a wide, low dais. Upon that sat a richly inlaid and carved throne-like chair. A banner hung behind it, embroidered with a golden eagle with wings spread, and the words, Cien, Ivlio, Agricola, Legato, AVG, Pro PR Municipi VM. Jade pointed to the words, a chill settling around her guts as she mentally translated the Latin script. Gnaeus Julius Agricola, legate of the emperor with pro-praetorian power. She paused, taking in the opulent surroundings again. Somehow I don't think it's Judai's tent. It must belong to the leader of these soldiers, one of Agricola's commanders, at least. Phoenix. Marcus's urgent summons brought both of them to his side. He was staring at the banner. For the first time since they had known him, the Roman boy looked anxious. He laid a hand on each of them, his dark eyes intense with some emotion. There's something important I have to tell you. Before he could finish, a new voice spoke pleasantly from the doorway. Ah, there you are, Marcus, and you've brought some friends, I see. Catching the sick, frightened look on Marcus's face, Jade spun to see this new threat. A tall, aristocratic man stood just inside the door. He wore the dress of a Roman soldier, but with much extra adornment and gilding to indicate a high rank. Over one shoulder was a soft white drape of cloth edged with gold. The helmet in his hands had scarlet plumes of feathers and more gilding. He placed it gently on a small table and advanced. His movements were that of a seasoned fighter, while his voice, and manners were of a civilized gentleman. The coldness of his dark eyes, however, spoke of a hard, intelligent man used to getting what he wanted by any means necessary. So Marcus, he nodded slightly. Will you introduce us, or shall I do it for you? When Marcus simply stared at the floor in silence, the Roman smiled. But it was not a nice smile. Jade shivered as he turned it on her. "Jade, isn't it? And Phoenix? I'm so pleased to meet you, finally. My son obviously thinks a great deal of you." When the two did nothing but gape at him, he raised one eyebrow and shook his head in mock regret. Smoothly, he sank into the throne-like chair, leaned back, and waved a hand at the banner overhead. Youngsters these days. Such manners. Didn't Marcus ever mention that his father was the governor of Britannia? You'd almost think he wasn't proud of my achievements. Chapter 17. Phoenix and Jade turned horrified looks on Marcus. His father was Governor Agricola, this cold, hard man in front of them. Agricola chuckled at their dismay. Marcus kept his eyes on his own toes, his mouth thin, his hands gripped into tight fists. Phoenix had a flash of recall. That was exactly how he had stood before his stepfather only a few days before in the real world. In that second of understanding, the brief flare of anger he'd felt against Marcus vanished. In its place was empathy. If this unpleasant Roman was Marcus's father, Phoenix could easily see why the boy had run away. If he really had. That was the key question. Had Marcus run away? Or had he just been planted to betray them to his father? Was that how Agricola knew so much about them now? Phoenix was hit with sudden enlightenment, and his momentary empathy vanished. He couldn't think of any other logical explanation. The Romans had known exactly where to find them and what their names were. Who else could have told them that? Anger burned again in his veins. They had taken Marcus into their group in good faith. He had betrayed them to their enemies. Phoenix slid a glance sideways at Jade. She was biting her lip and looking thoughtfully at Marcus. She rubbed the palm of her left hand with her right thumb. Then she looked under her lashes at Phoenix. She seemed to be trying to send him some sort of message. Her green eyes were narrowed. She tilted her head a little and rolled her eyes downward. He looked down, but all he could see was her finger pointing and tapping at the palm of her left hand. What was that all about? He inspected his own left hand, but saw nothing. Catching her eye again, mouthed "What?" to show he had no idea what she was trying to tell him. Jade grimaced in frustration and shook her head a fraction. A sudden movement attracted their attention back to the governor. He stood up. They stayed mute as he approached. He brushed past them and picked up the wine jug. In silence, he offered them a drink, shrugging when they all shook their heads. Agricola poured himself a glassful and sipped it. Over the rim, his hard eyes were thoughtful. With a voice like silk, he invited them to sit. When they continued to stand, he laughed and took the throne again, idly flipping a dagger over in his fingers. "Where is the jewel of Asgard?" He spoke in a pleasant tone, as though the answer was of little consequence. Phoenix looked up in shock. How could he know to ask them about it? He cast a fulminating glance toward Marcus, torn between relief that the Romans clearly didn't have the jewel and anger at being betrayed. Instead of catching Marcus's eye, he encountered a fierce glare from Jade that surprised him. "What the? Where is the jewel of Asgard?" the Roman governor repeated softly. He swirled the deep red wine in his glass, apparently fascinated by its color. "If you tell me now, we can avoid a great deal of unnecessary bloodshed." He smiled again. Jade wrapped her arms around herself, and Phoenix gripped instinctively for his absent sword. Agricola stood up and strode over to Jade. Tilting her chin up, he raised the point of his dagger to her face and pressed the flat of the iron blade against her pale cheek. She gasped and flinched away, raising a hand to her cheek. When she dropped her hand again, Phoenix saw an angry red mark there, like a burn in the shape of a blade. Agricola sneered. "I thought so. A fairy half-breed." Pacing in front of all three prisoners, he spoke in smooth, almost casual tones. "There is a man, Feng Shuai. Ah, I see you know of him. And of course." He nodded at Phoenix's start, then bowed politely towards his son. Marcus foolishly attempted to kill him not long ago. He laid a hand on his son's shoulder. Marcus jerked away. "Shuai will be here tomorrow." Agricola stepped in front of Phoenix and caught his eye. Phoenix lifted his head and stared back defiantly. Agricola leaned closer, his tone menacing. "You would be wise to tell me what I want to know. If you don't, then I will hand you over to Shuai for interrogation. Believe me." There was a flicker of loathing in his dark eyes. "You truly do not want to be interrogated by that man if you can avoid it." He straightened and paced back to Jade, touching her marked cheek with the tip of his finger. "He will do much worse than that. So take this last chance and tell me where the jewel is." When none of the three spoke, Agricola shook his head in mock regret. "Such a pity. It doesn't really matter, though. We know that it will be in the Great Stone Circle tomorrow with the druids. We'll just get it then. It may be a little more bloody than we anticipated. A great many druids will die, and that will be your doing. Your choice." He cocked an eyebrow at them. Still silent. "Very well. Guards." 4 more soldiers came in and saluted. "Take these 3 to the prison tent and guard them well." Agricola eyed Jade speculatively. "Set at least 30 men outside the tent, and another 30 at 10 paces away. That should be sufficient against whatever barbaric powers you possess." With a sharp nod, he dismissed them. Marcus, Jade, and Phoenix silently followed the Roman soldiers through the camp. Whispers and talk followed them in turn. One soldier standing by even threw a clod of dirt at Jade and yelled something rude about her elven blood. She flushed red, but kept her head down. Phoenix, however, ignored them, feeling fractionally more hopeful than he had since they'd left the Druid realm. There was still a chance to get the jewel before the Romans, still a chance to complete the level successfully. If Agricola was right, then tomorrow must be the spring equinox ceremony. The jewel would be at Stonehenge with the Druids. There had to be a way to get there in time. They had to escape. The soldiers marched them straight to a prison tent not far from Agricola's pavilion. The tent was not conveniently near the edge of camp, and the 60 guards set outside were not in any danger of allowing them to easily escape. On the contrary, the Romans assigned to guard them appeared grimly keen on their duty. Inside the small tent were just the bare essentials: 3 stools, 3 camp beds, a jug of water, and a large, lidded pot. After a moment's thought, Phoenix realized it must be a chamber pot, to be used as a toilet. He screwed up his nose and remembered of home and his own private bathroom with brief longing. All 3 companions slumped on either a bed or a chair without speaking. Phoenix sat with his elbows on his thighs, his hands and head hanging. Marcus lay on his back, staring blankly up at the canvas ceiling. After a while, Phoenix heard a noise and looked up to see Jade sitting with her hands covering her face. Slow tears were leaking out from between her fingers, and her body shook with sobs. Unable to stand the sound, he moved over beside her and put an arm awkwardly around her shoulders. "Hey," he patted her back. "It'll be okay. We'll find a way to escape. Come on." He gave her a little push on the arm. "We can't quit now. We're almost there." Jade dropped her hands and stared at him in despair. "I know that," she sniffed and scrubbed at her face. wincing as her sleeve scraped the iron burn there. "Don't you think I want to get out of here?" She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. "I just don't know what to do. Can't you?" Phoenix waved at the tent flap and made a vaguely magical motion with his hand. "You know, do something to the guards," he finished lamely. "No." It was a flat denial. On a good day, I could probably put 20 of them to sleep. With a sniff and a tremor in her voice, she continued, "But I'm tired. I haven't slept much for 2 days, plus there are 60 of them and a whole camp full beyond them. I'm useless." "Don't belittle yourself." Marcus's deep voice interrupted her self-criticism. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat up to face them. "You're far from useless. Your magic might be limited, but you're smarter than anyone else I know. Agric." He clenched his jaw and started again. "My father thinks he's got us trapped, but he's underestimated us, Jade. We can think our way out of this. We have to stop him and Judai from getting the jewel. We. What makes you think we want you to come along?" Phoenix leapt to his feet, growling at the Roman boy. "It's your fault we're in this mess." "My fault." Marcus jumped up and stood toe to toe with him, dark eyes snapping with anger. Phoenix poked him in the chest with a finger. "How did Agricola know our names? How did he know exactly where we were? How did he know about the jewel and the druids?" With each poke, Marcus paled and edged backward. "You told them, didn't you?" Phoenix hissed. "You betrayed us. You spied on us, and now we're here because of you." Seeing through a red haze of anger and pent-up frustration, Phoenix reached out and grabbed Marcus's tunic, ready to punch the living daylights out of him. "Stop it! Stop it, Phoenix! Marcus!" Suddenly Jade was between them, pushing Phoenix backward with surprising strength. The bed caught him behind the knees and he sat heavily, panting in anger. When Marcus tried to step around her, she gave him an ungentle shove, and he too had to sit down. "Marcus did not betray us, Phoenix." Jade stood with her hands on her hips, glaring at both of them. "How do you know?" Phoenix was scornful, certain he was right. She thrust her left hand under his nose. "Remember the binding spell I did?" She snatched up his hand and Marcus's and turned them palm upwards. "If one of us betrays the others, you get a sharp pain, the hand and the vine reappears, remember?" She shook their hands. "No pain, no vine. Marcus did not betray us." Phoenix pulled his hand away and inspected it. She was right. He felt nothing. He'd forgotten about that aspect of her spell. That's what she'd been trying to tell him in the pavilion. He'd been so caught up in righteous anger, he hadn't been thinking clearly. Feeling guilty, he looked over at Marcus. "Sorry," he apologized gruffly. "But you have to admit it's a logical thing to think." Marcus glanced up, eyes glittering for an instant before he turned away again. His shoulders slumped. "As much as I hate to say it, you're right." He scrubbed a hand over his face. "Even though I didn't mean to betray you, I did." "What?" Jade and Phoenix both yelped at the same time, fixing the Roman with hurt, disbelieving stares. "What do you mean?" Jade demanded. "I had forgotten one rumor about Feng Judai's magical powers." Marcus's reply was heavy with regret. "He has the ability to far-see people he knows. Judai knows me. He must have been watching me. And of course, you. Ever since we defeated that centurion in the forest. That's how he knew to send the cohort to us at the Dryad Tree. That's how he knew we were going to talk to Dewid and the Druids. That's how they know the Druids will be at the Circle tomorrow with the jewel. He couldn't find you in the fairy realm because I was in the Hylian Bagya. But it didn't matter because they knew where we were going." Marcus slumped forward, his head in his hands. "So it is my fault. You were right, Phoenix." The three were silent a while. digesting this astonishing piece out of information. Well, Jade cleared her throat and sat down like her legs had given way. That explains a lot. Phoenix struggled for a moment with his anger toward Marcus. It was hard to forgive him, but how could he really blame him either? The hairs on the back of his neck prickled at the thought of previous conversations. What had they said about their goals, powers, and ideas that might put them in further danger from their arch-enemy? Luckily, he realized, a lot of the vital conversations he'd had with Jade had been held out of earshot of Marcus. Hopefully that had protected them a bit anyway. He shook himself, seeking conviction and purpose again. Whatever happened, they couldn't stay here and wait for Judai. If he had found out about their amulets, then they needed to get away fast. The old woman in gray had specifically told them to protect the amulets. Handing themselves and their pendants over to Judai seemed like a really dumb move, so he began. What do we do about it? We can't stay here just waiting until Judai shows up tomorrow. We're too close to give up now. Isn't the druid ceremony at dawn? Energized by his own frustration, Phoenix began to pace the small tent, looking vainly for some miraculous escape route. Nothing appeared. I think, Jade began, then paused when the other two looked at her expectantly. I think I might be able to do something to Marcus that will stop Judai from eavesdropping on us, at least. Marcus began to look apprehensive. He clearly wasn't comfortable with the idea of more magic being performed on him. We could shove him back in the Hylian Bajia, Phoenix suggested, only half joking. Marcus cast him a scornful look. Jade shook her head. For starters, we don't have the bag, remember? I can't tell you what I'm going to do, for obvious reasons. I'll just have to do it. Marcus squared his shoulders and stood up. Well, get on with it then. Okay, she said, tapping her teeth and glancing around. Lie down on the bed with me. Phoenix, cover us completely with those blankets and don't uncover us until I say so, no matter what you see or hear. I don't want Judai to know what I'm doing. Phoenix almost choked in shock. Marcus gasped, stammering out an embarrassed refusal. Much to Phoenix's relief, Jade burst into embarrassed laughter. She blushed, shook her head, and called them both idiots. The boys exchanged sheepish grins, and the light-hearted episode did much to restore their friendship. Marcus lay on the bed, and Jade sat up beside him. When they were both completely draped in blankets, they looked extremely silly. Jade began to murmur soft elvish words, and Phoenix heard Marcus gasp in surprise. A faint, purple-blue light shone through the thin blankets. It seemed to be centered somewhere around his chest. As Jade continued to chant, the light traveled slowly all the way down to his toes, then right back up to his head, before settling again on his chest. In less than 10 minutes, it was over. Jade's form beneath the blanket slumped, and Phoenix heard her draw a deep, shuddering breath. Marcus quickly cast off the covers and sat up. He caught Jade in his arms just as she collapsed sideways. The red mark on her face was livid against her pale skin. Is she all right? Phoenix dropped to his knees beside them. Marcus slid awkwardly off the bed, and they maneuvered her onto it. Phoenix knelt on one side of her and Marcus the other. Her shadowed eyes were closed, her face white and drawn. What did she do to you? Phoenix wanted to know. The Roman shook his head. I have no idea. It just made me feel kind of cold all over. I don't feel any different now. Do I look any different? Phoenix inspected him. Nope. Whatever she did, it sure took it out of her. He laid light fingers on her neck and sighed in relief. Her pulse is regular. I think she's just sleeping. Marcus reached out and gently touched the tip of his finger to the burn on Jade's skin. Why did my father's blade mark her so? His eyes were full of her pain. Phoenix thought about it. I think iron is deadly to the fairy folk. She's only half elven, so it just burned her. The Roman nodded absently, smoothing Jade's white blonde hair back from her face, before clearing his throat and moving away. He back on another bed and stared hard at Phoenix. So now what? We can't really make any plans until we know what she did. We're probably pretty safe from Judai until he gets here tomorrow morning. We all need sleep, so... Phoenix quirked him a grin. We wait. Marcus groaned. Somehow I knew you were going to say that. Watu. Chapter 18. It was close to dusk when Jade at last awoke. Phoenix and Marcus took turns sleeping and watching over her. Phoenix grudgingly made use of the chamber pot. Marcus was surprised at his reluctance, but Phoenix couldn't imagine how to explain a flush toilet, so he didn't bother. At noon, a soldier handed some bread and cheese through the tent flap. The boys divided it into 3 and saved a large portion of the water for Jade as well. By the time she stirred, Phoenix was getting restless. She'd slept close to 10 hours. If they were going to come up with an escape plan, it needed to be soon. Nighttime was their best chance of avoiding guards. Finally, she shifted, groaned, and sat up. She rubbed her eyes, stretched and blinked in the gloom. Where? Oh. Recollection flashed across her face and she grimaced. I remember. Marcus. She swung her legs off the bed, squinted at the Roman boy, then nodded in apparent satisfaction. What is it? Phoenix murmured. Jade waggled a hand at him. I can see the spell I put on him like a kind of fuzzy purple aura around his body. What kind of spell? Marcus asked uneasily. Just a variation on an illusion spell, she replied. I sort of tweaked it to make it deflect far-seeing. So you're kind of like a stealth guy now. She smiled a little at Marcus's confused expression. Basically, it should mean that Judai can't far-see you anymore. Shooing the boys toward the front of the tent, she made use of the chamber pot. Tweaked? Marcus muttered to Phoenix. Stealth guy. Are these some sort of arcane magic words? Yes? Phoenix replied. It's a bit hard to explain. Don't worry about it. What was that noise? He jumped at the sound of Jade's voice right beside his ear. Don't sneak up on me like that, he scolded. Sorry, did you hear that? She frowned in concentration. I'm sure I heard something out there. Phoenix strained his ears, but heard nothing beyond the normal camp noises of people talking and laughing, pots banging, and fires crackling. Marcus listened too, but eventually both shook their heads. Jade huffed. I'm sure I heard. I don't know, maybe chanting. No, it's stopped now. Never mind. She sat back on a stool and began to gnaw on the bread and cheese they had left her. Okay, how are we going to escape, then? We were kind of hoping you'd come up with something, Phoenix shrugged. I'm more the action type. Surely you came up with something, she said thickly, swallowing down the food. Phoenix raked his fingers through his hair. Unfortunately, all my ideas involved having our weapons and equipment, and there being about 40 less guards, plus a lot of fog, or even rain, at a pinch. Has there been any sign of Judai arriving? Jade seemed anxious about that. I really don't want to meet him right now. He's way out of my league. League? Marcus shook his head, obviously not understanding the slang. He will not be many leagues away at all. My father said he would arrive tomorrow. If he were here, we would have undoubtedly been taken before him already. Well, Jade chewed slowly on the last fragment of bread, frowning. I guess our best chance is to wait until 3 or 4 in the morning, when the guards are sleepy. They will be expecting that, Marcus put in. I know, but they'll still be sleepy. Or at least a bit less alert. She grimaced. Fog would have been nice. Before you ask. She held up a hand at Phoenix when he opened his mouth. No, I can't make fog. Or rain. Actually, Phoenix said mildly, I was going to ask if you could do something with that illusion spell you mentioned. Like maybe make the guards think we were going one way. What? He trailed off as the other two looked at him in astonishment. Stupid idea. No, she blinked at him. Quite possibly a brilliant idea. I think I can put maybe 20 of the guards on this side into a light sleep and still have enough energy to throw an illusion that should fool the others. After that, we just have to make it to the edge of the forest and we can hide. What about our gear and weapons? Marcus reminded them. Oh, she frowned. I forgot. We might just have to leave them behind and steal weapons from the guards. We should have a plan B, in case one of us gets captured or held up too. The three of them discussed their escape plan in as much whispered detail as they could. There were a whole lot of ways in which things could go horribly wrong, but they had to make the attempt. Finally, Marcus and Phoenix settled down to sleep while Jade kept watch. Sometime after midnight, she woke them. The glow of campfires had died down, so the world outside was lit only by the ghostly, clear white light of the near full moon high above. Sounds of camp talk and revelry had been replaced by the occasional cough or snore as hundreds of soldiers slept around them. Outside their tent could be heard the creak of leather and low-voiced conversations of their guards. They're still awake, Phoenix whispered, easing a neck muscle stiffened from sleeping on the hard pallet. They are professional soldiers, Marcus noted dryly. Jade pulled back the tent flap a few centimeters and peered out. The guards are standing in 3 circles around the tent, she murmured. There are 10 close to us, 20 just beyond them, and 30 even further away. The first 10 and the 20 are facing us, but the others are facing outward. Can you do it? Phoenix looked past her into the moon-washed night outside. I don't know, she admitted. I just wish I had my herb bag. I could use some more energy, but we don't really have any other options, do we? The others shook their heads. Marcus laid a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. You can do this, Jade. Believe it. She sent him a quick look of gratitude mixed with self-doubt. Taking a deep breath, she whispered final instructions. I'm going to try and put a group of 20 on this side into a light trance sleep so they will look like they're still awake and standing up. Then I'll throw the illusion of us running the other way to draw off the rest. Ready? One problem, Phoenix muttered. We can't see in the dark like you can. It's almost a full moon, Jade hissed. It's as bright as day. You should be fine. Fair enough. He nodded once. He'd feel better once he had a sword in his hand. That was certain. Okay. Jade spoke one soft word in Elvish, and a kind of heaviness swept through the tent. Phoenix blinked, feeling the weight of her sleep spell brush him. She swayed a little. Marcus steadied her as she spoke a soft string of Elvish and pointed a finger toward the back of the tent. For just a second, he thought he saw 3 ghostly figures turn and run through the canvas. Marcus gasped and shivered. Jade sagged between them, stumbled, and recovered. Now, she whispered harshly, shaking off their hands and hauling open the tent flap. A hoarse cry went up from the guards around the side of the tent. For a moment, Phoenix thought they'd been seen, but the sound of movement, yelling of orders, and silhouettes of dark figures showed the guards rushing away from the tent opening. They were following Jade's illusion people. The plan was working. The 3 took several stealthy steps before almost colliding with the first sleeping guard. It was unnerving to see him standing, wide-eyed and motionless right in front of them. Phoenix had to snap shut his teeth to hold back a yell. His breath clouded in the cold night air. He managed to keep his wits enough to quickly slide 2 Roman swords out of their sheaths. Marcus followed suit, relieving 2 other soldiers of their weapons without hesitation. Phoenix hefted the gladii, feeling their strange weight and shape, wondering if he could use them effectively. They were several inches shorter than the weapon he normally carried, and had no hand guard. Jade whispered, "I can only hold both spells for a few minutes. Let's go." Phoenix nodded and began to thread his way through the guards toward what he hoped was roughly north. From Bryn's descriptions of Salisbury Plain in 80 AD, he was pretty sure Stonehenge would lie west and maybe a little south of this Roman encampment. It shouldn't be too far away either. They had decided, though, it would be safer to try and return to the Druid Forest Sanctuary. Hopefully they could get Bryn and the Jewel of Asgard before the dawn ceremony commenced. And that meant going back northeast again. The sound of guards chasing illusions began to rouse other soldiers. All around them, men in tents were asking sleepy questions and gathering weapons. Any second now, dozens of tent flaps would fly open, and hundreds more soldiers would join the fray. The 3 escapees began to run in earnest. Suddenly they cleared the tents and were racing toward the perimeter guards. Dozens of men stood in a loose circle around the camp. Some faced outward, watching for danger. Others peered inward, trying to understand the chaos happening inside the camp. Many held torches aloft. Their orders were obviously to stay put and hold the perimeter, but they were clearly hoping to get some action. Jade grabbed his arm and Marcus's. "Don't start anything. If you don't have to, you two. We all have to get through if we can, remember?" Phoenix nodded curtly. It was a nice idea, but he had a feeling they weren't going to be able to just waltz through the perimeter unchallenged. In a way, he preferred to stand and fight. He was tired of all this walking, talking, hiding, and running away. He was a warrior. Fighting was what his character did best. Sure enough, as they got nearer, the first soldiers stepped up and called out a command to halt and be recognized. The 3 kept running. More soldiers gathered. Phoenix glanced across at Jade and Marcus. "There's no way we'll all be able to sneak through now. Time for Plan B." He yelled at Jade. She and Marcus looked at each other and nodded. Jade fell back a few steps, letting the 2 warriors take the lead. Phoenix didn't see what happened next. He was too busy heading into battle in order to give her a chance to slip past. Holding a sword in each hand, he ran full tilt at the nearest soldiers. It was time for action. With a bloodthirsty yell, Phoenix fell on the enemy. His swords darted and flickered as he let his warrior instincts take over. With a clang, one blade met an opponent's, and his arm was jarred to the shoulder. He disengaged, deflected a second fighter's jab with his other sword, and twisted away from both. Now 3 closed in on him, calling out instructions to each other. Another tried to slip behind, but Marcus appeared, protecting his back. "Where's Jade?" The Roman parried 2 thrusts with a grunt. "She made it through the lines and has gone for the Druids, as we planned." "Well," Phoenix growled, "let's hold them as long as we can, and hope Jade can find Bryn and they can convince the Druids to help. Otherwise, this could be a very short fight. Why she thinks they'll help when they betrayed us, I don't know. We don't have a lot of other choices," Marcus replied grimly. There was no more time for talk. The pair fought on. Phoenix caught a blow on his forearm, glad the Romans hadn't taken his leather and iron arm guards. As it was, the force of it almost numbed his fingers. For several frightening seconds he could barely grasp the sword and had to lash out with a kick to escape being skewered. He stepped a little away from Marcus, then realized the soldiers were trying to separate them and moved back. Behind him, Marcus's heavier breathing and the slicker and clash of metal told him the Roman boy still fought strongly. They couldn't afford to let anyone between them. The only reason they weren't dead already was that the Romans couldn't all get close at once. There were only ever 3 or 4 near enough to trade blows at any one time. Desperation crept into Phoenix's heart, little by little. His arms slowed, the muscles starting to burn. His breath came in short gasps. Metal clanged again as he barely turned aside a jab aimed at his stomach. 5 Romans were down on his side, 3 dead and 2 badly wounded, but more stepped into the gaps. He wasn't going to last much longer at this rate, plus he was at a disadvantage. He wasn't used to working with gladiators, and they were. He had to change tactics. Just being a barbarian warrior wasn't going to cut it. He had to do something new. Drawing a deep breath, he opened the part of his mind that held his Aikido experience. There had to be a way to get this body to use both skills. He started to watch more closely how his opponents moved, conserving his energy to deal with truly lethal attacks rather than bluffs. Deliberately, he made his footwork more circular, more like Aikido movements. It was difficult. His ADD body memory kept trying to revert to chop and hack. Phoenix clenched his teeth, focusing all his will on the basic concept of Aikido. Blending. Only this time it was not an opponent he had to blend with. It was himself. His 2 minds and fighting styles. This had to work, or they were dead. Suddenly, as though a window opened in his mind, understanding flooded in. His body responded, moving as he wanted it to. His 2 styles of fighting seamlessly merging and under his full control. His movements became flowing, circular. His sword work more like that of a samurai. It was a brilliant move. These particular Romans had never fought against an Eastern style of swordplay. It confused them. They had no idea what to expect from his concise, centered movements. With a series of well-timed, well-placed blows, Phoenix sliced 5 soldiers from neck to torso, or from side to side. The others fell back, stunned by the ferocity of his attack. Behind him, Phoenix heard Marcus's breath coming quick and deep. "You okay?" he called anxiously. "Not for much longer," Marcus managed. "I know." Phoenix's heart sank as more soldiers crowded behind the Wandas, now eyeing them with open hostility. "I'm sorry I got you into this, and I'm honored to have known and fought with you, Marcus." "And you," the Roman boy replied, between white breaths. "Die well, friend." "Frankly," he said as the soldiers moved in again, "I'd rather not die at all, but we don't seem to have much say in it." Marcus gave a short laugh as his sword came up to block a blow at his head. Their opponents surged forward with renewed determination. Phoenix now blended his 2 sword styles to cause the most confusion possible. It worked for a while, but his strength drained away like water. More and more strikes came close to his body. He began to bleed from several small slices. Once he stumbled and barely managed to deflect a lethal cut to his throat. Then, just as his weary mind and body were at the point of complete collapse, he felt an odd surge of strength. It flowed like warm honey into his exhausted muscles, seeming to ooze into his body from somewhere outside it. Not questioning his bizarre good fortune, he plunged back into the fray. Fighting with renewed vigor, he ducked beneath a wild thrust to skewer another opponent. Things got even more strange. His enemies began slowing down. He could see clearly every blow that was about to fall, anticipate the next strike from the corner of his eye, slide easily out of the way of a thrown javelin. As he watched, bewildered, they continued to get yet more sluggish. It was truly uncanny, as though the world had slowed down or he had sped up to super speed. Finally, just when he was beginning to think he really had developed some kind of super abilities, the soldiers ceased all movement. Stunned, he straightened and stared about. Okay, he couldn't be that fast. All around was a freaky tableau of frozen motion. Lit by the red light of slow-flickering torches, snarling soldiers held swords upraised. One man had his arm drawn back to throw a javelin. An officer shouted silent orders. Dozens of men stood behind them, their faces distorted as they screamed noiseless encouragement. All as still as statues. Movement caught Phoenix's eye and he spun, sword ready. It was only Marcus, turning circles. His eyes were wide and wild as he ducked beneath a sword and came to Phoenix's side. What the? He was breathing hard. Blood from a cut on his thigh dripped steadily into the dust. Phoenix reached out and touched the hand of one of the soldiers. It was warm. The man rocked a little but didn't spring to life. I'm thinking magic of some sort, Phoenix decided. Jade must be around somewhere. I didn't think she was this strong, though. He peered past the crowd of soldiers toward the camp. He couldn't hear anything from beyond the circle of angry faces. Distant firelight showed dozens of figures, silhouetted like still shadow puppets, in front of the orange glow. The frozen zone seemed to extend throughout the Roman camp. Let's get out of here, Marcus advised. He snatched a cloak from the officer and tore it into shreds. With it, he bound the wound on his thigh. Phoenix did the same with the worst of his own injuries, then looked around. How do we get through? He indicated the solid wall of bodies between them and anywhere else. He didn't fancy trying to crawl between their legs. Marcus smiled wickedly. Ever played at 9 pins? To chapter 19. 9 pins. Phoenix laughed. He'd never heard of it, but could guess what it must be. He reached for the nearest motionless man. A gentle shove in the right direction, and the Roman toppled over like a tin toy soldier. He knocked into the person nearest, who fell, and in turn collided with his neighbor. Then, just like dominoes, the soldiers encircling Phoenix and Marcus teetered and fell into one another, one by one, with soft, fleshy sounds and heavy thuds. The wall of men fell and became a heap. The falling swelled until it became waves moving in circles away from the two warriors in the middle. Phoenix and Marcus watched in awe as soldiers fell like cut wheat. Finally, the bodies were spaced too far apart, and the domino effect slowed and eventually stopped. The boys stood in the center of what looked like a crop circle of flattened people. Swords, legs, and arms stuck up at odd angles. After exchanging an uneasy look, the companions walked where they could and climbed over the soft bodies where they couldn't find the ground. It was a very strange experience indeed. They were profoundly glad when they could at last weave their way through standing men past the edge of the camp. Stopping in a clear area, Phoenix peered into the shifting moonlit shadows. Jade had to be around here somewhere. Which way? Marcus asked. The silent Roman camp behind them was eerie. They both wanted to put space between them and it. To Kariga Amgarn, of course, a voice piped up from nearby. Phoenix felt a big grin split his face. Marcus's eyes lit up. Bryn? Phoenix squinted into the gloom. Is that you? The Breton boy stepped into the moonlight. In the flesh, he grinned. When Phoenix reached out to envelop him in a rough hug, the boy held out his hands and screwed up his nose. Not until you've had a bath, thanks. Phoenix looked down at his blood and sweat-spattered self and had to laugh. Coming from you, that means I must smell bad. Where's Jade? He demanded. And how did you two do this? He swept a hand at the still and silent Roman camp. Bryn grabbed his arm and tugged. Come on. Jade met us coming to get you. She and Truda have gone to Agricola's tent to get your gear back." "She met us?" Phoenix latched onto the first part. "Who's us? And who's Truda?" There was movement behind Bryn. A dozen or more druids stepped forward, lowering their hoods. Druid led, his expression contrite. Phoenix turned toward him with a growl, but Bryn jumped between them. "No." "They sent us into a trap," Phoenix argued. "That was all negotiated before the elders spoke with you," Druid said humbly. "The elders were simply trying to stop the Romans from destroying us, delaying them long enough so we could return the jewel and keep it out of their hands. We didn't realize what your quest entailed. We thought you were simply criminals the Romans were trying to recapture." Bryn's brother bowed his head. "I represent the elders in expressing our deepest regrets. We came to rescue you as soon as a decision had been reached." Phoenix stared at him. "You did all this?" He waved a hand back at the soldiers. Druid nodded, his face serene. "How?" The scope of it was dumbfounding. "It's complicated magic. It won't hold long, though, and we don't really have time to explain right at now." There was the merest flicker of a superior grin on the druid's mouth. "We must get you all to the stone circle in time for the dawn-spring equinox ceremony. The ceremony will allow you to complete your quest here and get the Jewel of Asgard away from the Romans." "But what about Jade?" Phoenix grabbed Druid's arm as the other turned away. "And where is the jewel?" "I've already given the jewel into Jade's keeping," the druid pointed, "and she is coming up behind you now." Sure enough, within seconds, Jade joined them. With her was a young girl about Bryn's age. She was helping Jade to carry their equipment and weapons. As she handed him his sword and shield, she gave Phoenix a friendly smile, showing even white teeth and clear blue eyes. Fiery red hair was tightly bound in 2 long braids down to her waist. She wore a cowled robe, like the druids, and Druid greeted her with a gentle smile. Phoenix was about to ask who the heck she was, when Druid turned away and strode off abruptly into the night, without another word. Jade threw him a smile and a nod, and followed with Bryn, the girl, and the other druids. Marcus and Phoenix exchanged confused looks and trailed behind. Belatedly, Phoenix realized the red-headed girl must be this Truda Bryn had mentioned. Dismissing her as irrelevant, he concentrated on following the others without tripping. Clouds scudded across the moon, and the ground was dewy and uneven. Add to that his own weariness from the fight, and he was bound to fall on his face if he wasn't careful. Marcus moved alongside and sent him a speculative glance. "Good fight," he murmured. Phoenix nodded. A savage grin crept over his mouth as he remembered. It had felt good. They had run away from danger too often on this trip. The fight had been somehow satisfying. He'd managed to resolve the split in his mind over which fighting style to use. Now he could use both or either at will. It was so cool. His grin widened. This was what he'd started this game for. Adventure, excitement, fun. Abruptly, he was swept by guilt. Fun. Killing people for fun. At the beginning of this adventure, he had been sickened by the idea of killing, even though he'd believed, logically, that this was a game, and these people were only digital ghosts. After meeting the old woman, he wasn't so sure of that. Yet he'd run into that fight like the most bloodthirsty warmonger in history, and he'd enjoyed it. Not the killing, he realized, but the adrenaline rush of the fight itself. If these people were truly real, what sort of monster did that make him? No monster, he told himself. Just a gamer, a survivor. At what cost? Where was the do the right thing ethic he'd been discovering only a day or so ago? Was the warrior stronger than his father's influence and his sensei's example, after all? As individuals, each one of those soldiers had done nothing to deserve death at his hands, digital or not. He was revolted by his own actions. The memory of those deaths rose in his mind, lingering. Over and over, the soldiers died in front of him. He heard their screams until he thought he was going to throw up. "What troubles you?" Marcus gripped his arm, drawing him back to the reality he was living now. Phoenix sent him a worried look. "I killed at least 8 of them." He ground his teeth to prevent bile rising. Marcus raised his brows and sent him a "so" kind of look. "And I killed 6. It was us or them." "But was it the right thing to do?" Phoenix pleaded, hoping to be absolved. "It was the only thing we could have done," Marcus replied firmly. "They died an honorable soldier's death. There is nothing to be ashamed of. I don't understand why you are distressed. We are at war." Phoenix looked away. Surely there would have been another, less deadly way of escaping if he'd really tried to find it. He'd rushed straight in, eager for battle, blood, and thrills. He had let his father, his sensei, and himself. Now he was going to pay the price. Those soldiers' agonized faces would haunt his sleep. "Hey, Marcus." Jade's hail interrupted his thoughts, and Phoenix was grateful for it. "I thought you might like to know that I tipped an entire jug of wine over your father's head and stuck a grape up his nose while he was frozen." Marcus stared at the girl in shock for a moment. Then, to the amazement of everyone who knew him, his calm face lit up in a smile of the most unholy delight. Bryn giggled. Marcus grinned more widely. Then he too began to chuckle. Before long, all 4 companions were laughing hard, holding their sides and hugging each other in relief. It was several moments before Duid could bring their attention back to the matter at hand and get them moving again. "Thanks for rescuing us." Again. Phoenix smiled wryly at Jade, pushing his darker thoughts aside. She smiled back, a hint of respect in her eyes. "You guys seem to be doing pretty well on your own against 100 or so soldiers. I just figured I should get the heck out of there while I could, and leave you to it." "Sure you did." Phoenix refused to rise to her teasing. It was Plan B, after all. "Anyway," she added diffidently, "it's Duid and the others who did the magic freezy trick. Bryn had already convinced them to come to our rescue. Remind me to thank both of them later." "You may not have time." Jade pointed ahead. Dimly, Phoenix could just make out silhouettes of the massive standing stones of Stonehenge not far away. A faint gray light was once again coloring the eastern sky. It was close to dawn. David had said they needed to be at the stone circle before the spring equinox ceremony was completed. Why, Phoenix didn't know. He still wasn't even sure what an equinox was. But he was willing to go on faith for the moment. Too tired to do much else. So the weary group picked up their pace until they were almost running across the plain. The group arrived from the northeast, topping a slight rise just as the first pinks of sunrise began to color the sky. Phoenix had never actually been to Stonehenge in his own time, and he was awestruck by the sheer majesty of the structure. Not only were the stones massive, but all of them were in place, just as they had appeared in the hologram shown by their amulets. Jade clutched at Phoenix's arm, and the two stopped for a moment, both stunned by the regal strength and beauty of the scene before them. The clouds cleared. The moon had almost set. Overhead and in the west sparkled the last few stars. Stonehenge stood magnificently alone in the middle of the plain, its outer ring of enormous gray sarsen stones beginning to catch faint hints of pink. There were 30 of them, each one 4 meters high and 2 wide. Set in a massive circle, Every stone was joined to the next by a perfectly fitted lintel stone lying atop. Within that circle, Phoenix could just make out the inner circle of shorter blue stones. Inside, that was a horseshoe of 5 groups of 3 huge stones, 2 vertical and 1 atop in each set. They looked like 5 giant doorways. Finally, mirroring those, was a horseshoe setting of more blue stones. Phoenix glanced at Jade, but she was squinting and blinking at the great circle. He knew what that meant. Magic? She nodded. Lots. I can, kind of, see people inside. Druids, I think. Phoenix stared, but to him Stonehenge seemed empty. He gave up, taking her word for it. We should get a move on then. Just as he said it, Druid waved them forward urgently. The entire group began to run the last few hundred meters to the sacred site, their breath puffing in the cold morning air. Phoenix grinned even though his legs ached. They were nearly there. A few more minutes and they would have confounded Agricola and Judai and be into the next level of the game. He wasn't quite sure why they had to be involved in the spring equinox ceremony, but everyone else seemed to believe it was vitally important, so he figured it must be. Heck, if all they had needed was the jewel, and Jade had that, then surely the quest was over. So if it wasn't, then logic said they needed to take one more step. Hopefully this druid ceremony was it. As if sensing his confusion, Jade slipped in beside him and gave a quick explanation. The vernal equinox. She stopped as he blinked at her in mystification. Okay, the spring equinox then is the day when the sun rises right over the equator. It means spring is definitely here and winter is over. So the druids thank the goddess. They celebrate the rebirth of the earth, animals and plants, and the land's readiness for planting of summer crops and stuff. She added as an afterthought, it was the original Easter celebration, really. Oh, okay. He puffed as they ran. I'm not sure I needed to know that, but thanks anyway. She rolled her eyes. Honestly. She jogged ahead, clearly annoyed that he wasn't interested in her history lecture. Phoenix sighed. He couldn't help it if she was a walking encyclopedia, and he wasn't. He glanced around. Marcus had fallen slightly behind. The wound on his leg must be giving him trouble. Phoenix slowed down and waited for him. Ahead, Dewitt ushered his fellow druids, Jade, Bryn, and Truda, beneath the gigantic sarsen stone ring. Even though he'd sort of expected it, Phoenix still found it unnerving when they all vanished as they passed beneath the lintel stones. Dewitt stayed and waved at them to hurry up. Panting and limping, Marcus caught up with him and the two joined the druid. We must hurry, Dewitt urged. Yeah, Phoenix nodded. I can see it's almost dawn, but Marcus is hurt and I'm not leaving him behind. He hooked the Roman boy's arm over his own shoulder and took some of his weight. Marcus grunted thanks, his face pale and set. He's not the problem. Dewitt pointed back the way they had come. They are. The boys turned to look and groaned. Sweeping down the same slight hill they had just stood on was a wall of scarlet and leather. Soldiers. It seemed like most of the Roman encampment had been turned out on force to recapture the fugitives. They've seen us, Phoenix yelled. Will your magic keep them out? Dewitt shook his head. It's only an illusion that prevents people seeing inside the stone circle. We cannot be cut off from the earth by a shield at this moment. It is a time to celebrate our connection to the world, not isolate ourselves. If we raise a shield, the ceremony won't work, and the portal you must pass through will not open. Your quest would be incomplete and you would be recaptured. He looked gravely at the two boys. You cannot allow the Jewel of Asgard to fall into the hands of the Romans or Feng Judai. They would have too much power, and the balance and harmony of the earth would be disrupted. Phoenix snapped a quick frown at the druid. remembering the yin-yang, balance, and harmony amulet he and Jade wore. Could it be just a coincidence? Or had the druid said something significant? "How much time do we have?" Marcus asked through gritted teeth. "Our people will do what they can to keep the Romans outside the circle." The druid replied quickly. "The elders have begun the ceremony. You must stay together. Phoenix." Druid thrust a small cloth-wrapped item into his hand and closed his fingers over it. "Use this when the time comes. Give it to whomever asks for the jewel. It will buy you enough time to escape through the portal if you need it. Bryn will show you the portal when it opens." As he spoke, he pushed them between the stones. Bemused, Phoenix tucked the small parcel into the front of his shirt and hurried on. Inside, Phoenix spared little time on being surprised by the number of brown-robed druids milling about. There seemed to be hundreds, and many carried quarterstaves and clubs. A path opened. Phoenix helped Marcus through the respectful crowd to where Jade and the others stood, loosely encircling a large altar stone. She cast them a concerned look, but he waved her back. There simply wasn't enough time to heal them, and he doubted she had the energy right now anyway. Several of the elders nodded regally in acknowledgement as the companions reunited. At the altar, an ancient druid began chanting something unintelligible. He turned and faced east, toward the rising sun. His voice rose and fell, like the sea. Soon even Phoenix could almost taste the purple-blue zing of magic in the air. His whole body began to hum, and he felt the insane urge to take his shoes off and dig his toes into the soft earth beneath. He thought he could actually feel grass growing under his boots. Each breath of morning air seemed to taste sweeter than the last. A dawn chorus of bird songs suddenly filled the sky. Jade's eyes were wide with awe. Marcus drew a surprised breath and ducked out from beneath Phoenix's arm. Glancing down in amazement, Phoenix noticed the ground was now carpeted with flowers of every sort, with more opening each second. The young girl, Truda, bent down, patted the ground like it was a sleeping puppy, then calmly picked dozens of blooms and lay them on the altar like an offering. He felt a tug on his sleeve and saw Marcus pointing to his wounded leg. Phoenix raised his eyebrows in surprise. The deep thigh slice had healed into a thin, white scar. Inspecting themselves, the two fighters realized all of their injuries were similarly cured. Then, just as the first shimmering sliver of sunlight peaked above the horizon, the ancient druid's chant became a shouted, joyous song of life. As he raised his arms, his cry was echoed by hundreds of deep voices and hundreds of lifted arms all around them. Phoenix felt a kind of soft explosion thump through his body and radiate outward from the stone circle. In the distance, even the Roman soldiers staggered as it passed through their ranks. From the corner of his eye, he noticed that the space between the largest set of 3 sarsen stones quiver and shine like the surface of liquid. As he tried to make sense of what it might mean, Bryn grabbed at his arm. "There," he pointed excitedly at it. "That's the portal we must go through." Quickly, he dragged Phoenix forward. "It will only stay open a short time. If we miss it, the chance will not come again until the autumn equinox." "But the jewel," Phoenix protested. "We have it," Jade answered. "Come on." The companions were moving toward the portal when, in a horrible parody of that worshipful druid chant, the Roman horde fell upon the druids with a blood-curdling battle cry. Chapter 20. Phoenix hesitated, looking back at the battle. He wasn't going to abandon the druids to their deaths. They were vastly outnumbered and carried blunt weapons against a field of swords, arrows, and javelins. they wouldn't last 10 minutes. Even as he reached for his sword, a flash of light and a loud crack echoed across the plain. After a moment of stillness, two of the enormous outer sarsen stones toppled outward in frightful slow motion. When they and their lintel stone struck the ground, it was like an earthquake. The shockwave smacked into Phoenix's chest and shook the ground. Everyone staggered. There was a brief hiatus in the fighting as another stone teetered, and those nearest stopped to judge its fall. With hoarse, warning yells, Romans and Druids alike jostled to run from it. Then Phoenix saw who was responsible. The same ancient Druid who had performed the spring rite stood atop the altar stone and pointed at another sarsen. Another flash of light exploded at the base, and it, too, toppled. Suddenly the old Druid clutched at his breast and, with a choked cry, fell from the altar. A Roman arrow protruded from his heart. The magic he had performed still took its toll. More massive standing stones fell, just like the domino effect he and Marcus had caused earlier. Stunned, Phoenix realized what he was seeing. He and Jade were causing the destruction of Stonehenge. When it was over, there would be only 17 of the 30 outer stones left standing. A cry from his left drew his attention. Druid and a group of Druids were fighting for their lives against a dozen Romans, with more coming up behind. Without a second thought, Phoenix raced toward them, drawing his sword and unslinging his shield in one smooth move. Uttering a wild, wordless shout, he sprang off a fallen stone and fell upon the Romans from behind. 3 quick slashes dropped 3 soldiers. A 4th man thrust wildly, but Phoenix turned the gladius aside with his shield and slid his own blade underneath the overlapping armor plates on the man's breast. The soldier gasped and sagged to his knees. Phoenix pulled the edge free and turned to face his next opponent, baring his teeth in a growl. Marcus appeared by his side, ready again to fight with him. Phoenix grinned at him. The Roman nodded back. Druid cracked a soldier over the head with calm efficiency, shoving the body into his swordmates so they stumbled and tripped over each other. Phoenix reached his side and mock saluted. "Want some help?" The Druid frowned at him. "No, get out of here. Get the jewel and my brother through the portal." "No way." Phoenix shook his head, ducking under a swinging sword and chopping at the arm that wielded it. "I'm not leaving you lot to die." "Noble, but stupid," Druid growled. "You have to leave us. Our whole task is to make sure the jewel is kept out of Roman hands. If the governor gets hold of it, not only Albion will fall, but this entire world will be lost, and yours as well. Leave, now." Phoenix paused in mid-stroke, staring at the Druid in astonishment. "My world? What? How?" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Another gladius descended toward his head, and he had to focus on not being killed. Druid grunted. "Look around. The day is lost, whether you stay or go." Phoenix spared the rest of the field a glance and saw he was right. Everywhere the distinctive scarlet and leather Roman uniforms overwhelmed the paltry few brown-robed Druids left standing. He dispatched another soldier with ruthless anger. It wasn't fair. Bryn's brother grabbed his arm. "You must go. Take the jewel and get through the portal before it closes. If you miss it, you won't be able to leave until the autumn solstice, and that will be too late. Hurry, the jewel is in danger. You must protect her." "Her?" Phoenix looked wildly around. The Druid nodded toward the portal. Near it, Jade, Bryn, and half a dozen Druids fought valiantly. They had formed a protective circle. In its center, Phoenix caught a flash of red hair. "Truda?" He blocked a dagger strike and parried a pilum jabbed at Marcus's back. "Truda is the jewel? Are you kidding me?" He eyed the young red-headed girl with shock. Truda was the jewel of Asgard. Whose idea was that? He'd been expecting a gemstone, something easy to carry. What the heck were they supposed to do with Kid to coddle and babysit? Damn it. A thunderous crack made him jump. From Druid's hand shot a flare of greenish electricity. Roman soldiers flew through the air to land in broken scarlet heaps, clearing a path back to Jade and the others. The Druid laid a hand on Phoenix's arm. I can only do that once. Gomo, please take Bryn with you. Phoenix glanced at Marcus. The Roman nodded solemnly. You know I would fight with you to the death. But the Druid is right. We have to remember the end we all desire. Feng Judai. It was true, Phoenix realized. Staying here couldn't be his decision alone. If he didn't go, they'd all suffer the consequences of his choice. He had to do what was right for all of them and for both worlds, not just what he wanted. With a growl of frustration, he turned away. Together, he and Marcus ran through the fallen, back to their companions. Jade cast him a look of pure relief and desperation. Let's go then. He had to yell over the noise of the battle, had to grit his teeth against the desire to fling himself headlong back into the fray. As a group, they began to edge toward the shimmering portal. The remaining Druids covered their retreat, falling and dying with Roman arrows quivering in their chests. Phoenix raised his shield, feeling more shafts thunk into the wood. He lowered it and chopped the ends off, glaring. It wouldn't hurt to stay a little longer and take out just a few more of these bastards, surely. Abruptly, the choice was taken out of his hands. A large contingent of Roman soldiers swarmed through the remaining Druids, encircling the players and the few surviving Druids with frightening speed and efficiency. They were cut off from the door. His hesitation had cost them the game. As 50 or more swords and javelins pointed at their hearts, the deep sound of a horn whooped out thrice across the stone circle, echoing strangely among the rocks. Immediately those Romans still fighting fell back to the perimeter stones and formed a solid barricade of armor and weapons. Inside the circle, bodies lay thick on the ground. A few remaining Druids stumbled toward the portal, trying to regroup for the next attack. There were no more attacks. The Roman soldiers simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, rank upon rank, waiting. The 5 young travelers stood within a circle of steel, weapons drawn. Truda, they thrust into the center, protecting her as best they could. The portal shimmered, just out of reach behind the Roman lines surrounding them. They waited, but not for long. There was a stir amongst the Romans standing between 2 of the Sarsen stones. They parted and let someone through. Phoenix saw Marcus clench his fists. Agricola strode arrogantly into the circle, scarlet cape billowing in the dawn breeze, hair still damp from Jade's dousing. He glanced with indifference at the carnage before sending his son a cool smile. Picking his way between the bodies, the Roman governor made his way up to the little group of survivors and stood, surveying them with calm hauteur. "Give me the jewel." His pleasant voice was at odds with the scene around them. It sounded like he was politely requesting a drink at a bar. "Come and get it," Phoenix snarled. Agricola shrugged. "Give me the jewel and I will spare your lives." Phoenix raised his eyebrows at him, doubting every word. "Somehow I find that hard to believe." Agricola lost a little of his cool. Glaring, he shoved his way through the line of men until he was within a few feet of the defiant little group. He stood over Phoenix, aristocratic face stiff with anger. "All right, give it to me now, or I will have you all slaughtered, including my treacherous son and these children." He eyed the group contemptuously. "And I will find it on your dead bodies." At that moment, Phoenix realized Agricola didn't know. He actually didn't know the jewel was Truda. Agricola still thought, as they had, that the jewel it was a thing. He remembered the little packet given to him by Druid. Now it all made sense. Wishing there was some way to warn the others, Phoenix allowed his shoulders to slump and his head to drop. "All right," he said, trying to sound defeated. "You win. Let us go, and you can have it." Behind him, Jade gasped. Marcus reached out and dug his fingers into Phoenix's arm. "What are you doing? He won't keep his word," the boy muttered. Phoenix twisted free, trying to convey a message in the glare he turned on his friends. "I know what I'm doing. Remember what Druid said? This is the only way to save ourselves." Marcus's expression cleared to understanding. He stepped back. "Jade," Phoenix frowned at her, flicking a quick glance down at Truda, then over at the glimmering portal. "Just be ready." Reaching slowly into his shirt, he drew out the small packet and revealed it to his friends. Jade and Bryn looked confused, then tried to hide it as they caught on. He hoped Agricola hadn't seen their expressions or the game would be up. Jade took hold of Truda's hand and pulled her close. Marcus laid a hand on Bryn's shoulder. The younger boy nodded. With a deep sigh of regret, Phoenix turned back to the governor. "Here then, take it. Take." 5 guards held sword tips at Phoenix's throat as he reached out, dropped the packet into Agricola's hand, and backed away again. Marcus moved up to stand beside Phoenix. "Look," he pointed outside the devastated circle of standing stones, to the horizon beyond. In the distance, a group of horsemen galloped toward the Carrega Amgard. The flag, the red bird on a black background, Phoenix spotted it whipping over the head of the lead rider. "What about it?" He switched his gaze back to the Romans. The archers drew back their strings. "It is Judai's personal guard," Marcus murmured. "He comes." Phoenix swore long and inventively. There were 500 Romans between them and their arch-nemesis. They had but moments to live, and absolutely no way of getting close to him alive. Even worse, they couldn't get away either. Eager and triumphant, the governor of Britannia laughed. Parcel in hand, he turned away with a swirl of his cloak and held it high above his head. A great cheer swept through his army. "I have it. Now we will triumph," he shouted. Another cheer erupted. Agricola shouldered his way back through his men. Glancing back, he gestured at his son to join him. Marcus returned his look stonily and didn't move. "Very well." Agricola shrugged and nodded to his captain, his fingers busy with the outer coverings on the packet in his hands. "Kill them all." The Romans advanced, spears leveled and arrows nocked. "Now." Jade's frightened whisper reached his ears. Phoenix shook his head. "I don't think." There was a blinding flash of reddish light, a hoarse scream, shouts from Agricola's men as they tried to reach their fallen commander, confusion and fear amongst the soldiers as smoke billowed in all directions. The rank of men surrounding the companions wavered and broke, running to see what new threat had attacked their governor. "Now," Phoenix yelled. As one, the little group turned and sprinted for the portal. Half a dozen stalwart soldiers still guarding the structure stood their ground, trying to prevent their escape and carry out their last order to kill. Phoenix used his momentum to full advantage. He turned aside one blade and shoulder-charged the soldier carrying it. The man stumbled, falling into his nearest shieldmate. Turning, Phoenix lashed out at the next man, catching the blade with his own sword and stabbing with his dagger. The soldier folded over the little blade with a look of surprise, then slid to the ground without a sound. Hampered by her need to keep Truda close, Jade seemed to struggle to fend off 2 soldiers with just her quarterstaff. Bryn crawled through a gap and was now behind the soldiers, his little dagger wreaking havoc In unexpected and painful places, Marcus lingered, watching, protecting their backs as more soldiers realized their quarry were escaping. "Jade," Phoenix called. "Get Truda through the gate. We'll be right behind you." She grabbed Truda's hand and pulled the girl through a gap created when Bryn hamstrung a soldier. A swift strike with her staff dispatched yet another man who attempted to grab the young red-headed girl. Phoenix dodged a badly aimed thrust and slipped inside the soldier's guard to slide his blade neatly between exposed ribs. The portal rippled as first Truda, then Bryn vanished through it. Jade paused, looking back at them. "Come on, you two. Hurry," she urged. "There are more coming. You can't fight them all." She leapt through with one last anxious look over her shoulder. Phoenix cast one quick look at Judai's men. They were still too far away even for a suicide mission. As much as it galled him, he had to run for it with the others. Phoenix caught Marcus's eye, and together they began to retreat toward the portal, still exchanging blows with Romans as they moved. They were less than 10 meters away. 8, 5, 4, go, Phoenix said curtly. The doorway was too narrow for two people to jump through abreast. Marcus hesitated, then threw himself into the silvery surface and vanished. Phoenix deflected a blow aimed at his head and another that would have gutted him. The press of soldiers forced him back. If he went through now and the portal stayed open, how the heck was he going to stop them coming through after him? The Romans stopped. They formed a loose semicircle in front of him, eyeing the portal with superstitious misgivings. Phoenix grinned. It seemed their fear of Brittonic magic was greater than their desire to capture him. Behind them, he caught a glimpse of Agricola's scarlet cloak billowing as the governor stalked back toward the portal. His expression was that of apoplectic fury. Apparently, the flash bomb hadn't done any lasting damage. Swearing, Phoenix tucked his sword under one arm and snatched a pilum from the lax hand of a dead Roman. Hefting it, he took aim and hurled it with all his considerable strength toward the governor of Britannia. The soldiers around him turned to follow its path, groaning as they saw its trajectory. The spear arced gracefully through the smoky air, sliding down a smooth curve toward its target. Someone shouted a warning. Agricola glanced up a fraction late. He flung himself to one side, but the lethal tip sliced through his decorative armor and buried itself in his shoulder. Staggering, he fell backward. Soldiers rushed to his side, hiding him from Phoenix's searching gaze. Had he killed the governor or only wounded him? He was fairly sure it hadn't been a killing shot. More's the pity. Whatever the result, it was time to leave, before the soldiers nearest came out of shock and renewed their attack. With a mocking bow, Phoenix turned on his heel. 2 swift strides brought him to the doorway. He paused for a moment, wondering whether it would hurt, whether home was on the other side, whether anything was on the other side, whether this was the end of his adventure or just the end of level 1. A large part of him hoped it wasn't over. He'd never felt more alive. Shrugging, he stepped forward. There was a sharp sting between his shoulder blades. A rush of agony swept through his chest. He tried to yell, but drew only pain into his lungs. Strength fled from his limbs. He fell through the portal and into blackness. In his dark prison, Long Bayou laughed softly. Around his battered body, a faint halo of purple-blue began to shine. His laughter grew until it bounced back to him from the stone walls and rang faintly through the palace above. The end. If you enjoyed this book, look for the sequel, 80 AD, The Hammer of Thor, at Smashwords. Book 3, 80 AD, The Tekken of Anuket, is also on Smashwords. Find out more at http://www.ieflintheart, Weebly.com or Smashwords, author page. Ike Flintheart, A Taste of Things to Come. 88, Level 2, The Hammer of Thor. Chapter 1, Jade opened her eyes to an uneasy world of grays and blacks, of unidentifiable shapes and soft, sighing sounds. She lay on her stomach, awkwardly sprawled on something cold, slippery, and hard. Her right knee ached like she'd knocked it, and her right hand stung. "Hello?" Her voice seemed muffled. Something cold and wet feathered across her cheek. She touched her face with numb fingers and shivered. "Phoenix." The darkness eased somewhat. Perhaps her eyes were adjusting. Around her, patches of light and shadow shifted and swam. It was difficult to tell where the ground ended and the rest of the world began. Jade gathered her feet beneath her and staggered upright. Shaking, she pulled the hood of her cloak up and tucked her fingers into her armpits to warm them. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder, dragging at her arm. As she took an uncertain step, her foot kicked something long and wooden, her quarterstaff. Snatching it up, she tried to feel more secure. Was she alone here? Wherever this was, it certainly wasn't home. She tried to hold back a rising sense of betrayal. She'd been so certain that finishing level 1 would catapult her home again. It hadn't. This wasn't her England. In fact, it probably wasn't England at all. A wolf howled, distant, mournful, eerie, definitely not England. Sharp, fitful breezes stung her eyes. Jade blinked and scrubbed a hand over her face, trying to hold back bitter tears of disappointment. She just wanted to go home. For the 100th time in the last 5 days, she wished she'd never turned her father's computer on, never been drawn into this bizarre digital world. Wished that she was home again in her warm house with her 6 annoying sisters. She missed her father, her own warm, comfortable bed, and hot showers. Roaming the 80 AD world sounded awesome. When she was watching her avatar on a flat screen from the comfort of her father's study, living it was a whole different thing. Her scared 13-year-old mind was trapped inside the digital body and memories of a 17-year-old half-elf in a strange time and place. She'd been nuts to think living the adventures she'd always read about in books would be romantic and exciting. Right now, the most awesome thing she could think of to see would be the giant golden arches of a McDonald's restaurant or her very own bathroom. The ground crunched as she stamped her feet to warm them. More cold, fluffy stuff fell on her face, and Jade at last realized what it was. Snow. A wolf howled again, closer. A primeval sound that echoed strangely and made the hairs on the back of her neck rise up. Dark forms around her resolved into trees. She was in a snowy, dark forest somewhere. Well, that didn't help much. How could it be snowing at night, when it had been a clear spring dawn in the ancient Britain they had just left? The last thing she remembered was jumping through the portal from Stonehenge in a desperate attempt to escape a horde of Roman soldiers and their ambitious governor, Agricola. She'd thought the portal was going to get her home, but it must have brought her to level 2 of the game instead. If that was right, then home was still a long way off. 4 more levels, in fact. So if she was on level 2, where were Phoenix and the others? A low moan to her left sent her in that direction, feeling her way carefully. A dark lump in the snow moaned again. Her hands touched leather and steel. "Phoenix," he moaned again. "Phoenix." She dropped to her knees. He lay face down in the snow, his skin cold, his pulse a bare thread. She ran her hands over him, using her spellweaver skills to try and sense injuries. He had fought the Romans until the last, to give the rest a chance to get through the portal. Had he been wounded? Her seeking fingers touched wood. She gasped in horror. 2 arrows protruded from his back, very close to his heart, by the feel of them. Her instinct was to yank them out, but hesitating, she took her hand away. She had fought the Romans with as much magic as she could. If she pulled them out now, she didn't have the strength to heal such deep wounds quickly enough. He would die. His only chance was if they could find shelter and warmth. She needed food and her herbs to replenish enough strength to save him. She needed help. Where were the others? "Oh, my head!" A voice behind made her turn. "Marcus?" She hurried over, slipping in the deepening snow. Strong hands grasped hers. Jade sobbed in relief, clutching at them like a lifeline. "Are you okay?" "Yes. Just a headache bad enough to kill a god." "Where are we?" The Roman boy sounded pained. Another smaller figure joined them. "Somewhere dark, wet, and way too cold," it said, helpfully. "Bryn." Jade hugged him, feeling how thin and small he was beneath his patched clothes. "Where's Truda?" "I'm here," the young red-headed girl piped up. "It's awful cold here." She wrapped her too big druid cloak tighter about herself. A flurry of wind and snow snatched the hood off her face. In the gloom, her big blue eyes were dark holes in a white oval. Jade grabbed Marcus's hand and hauled him upright. "Phoenix has been hurt. We need to find shelter or he's going to die." "Show me," Marcus ordered. She led them to their fallen friend. Marcus felt his pulse for a long moment. He shook his head, barely visible in the gloom. "It's too late, Jade. His heart has stopped. He's gone, Jade. Phoenix is dead to be continued."